sitting here with Dylan Carmody, and I don't what happened. I think I just DM'd you and was like, "Hey, you want to do a podcast?" Because you had been on E3. I had seen your name in other places on calves and Achilles. The big thing that you came out with was that thing with Andy McDonald, that calf profiling thing. And I barely ever share other people's products on my social media, but that was one where I'm like, I posted a few times and I'm like, just buy this thing. It's like $20, I think. Great resource. Anyways, tell people who you are.
Yeah, man. Jake, first of all, thanks for the opportunity. Been a big fan of the podcast for a while. I can still remember, like back in early PT school days, listening to some of the OG, podcasts in 2020 and stuff like that. And so it's cool to see where the development's gone, as well as now to at least shoot the shit a little bit and talk about calves. But for anybody who's not familiar, my name is Dylan Carmody Rotolo. I am a physical therapist and strength and conditioning coach in the Central Oregon region. I live in Bend, and currently hold a couple different roles. Namely, I work as a technical content manager for Vault, which is a sports and health technology company. Essentially, what the role means is I just work on a lot of the educational and long form content. So any practitioners' guides or data reports that come out or articles that we publish, a lot of that either I help out with, I draft, I edit, I do something associated with it, as well as just kind of, play a hand in other different projects along with Vol, just because it's a big company, everybody kind of has their hand in a bunch of different areas. But alongside that, I also still do a little bit of S&C work and a little bit of rehab work on the side. I guess you could call it direct performance. I do S&C and a little bit of sports science work with a local basketball club in town, as well as a local high school basketball team in town, and then treat patients a little bit on the side, as well as every now and then we'll get yanked into like a consulting type role for higher profile cases when it pertains to sticky calf and Achilles issues.
Mm-hmm. Um, okay, why the calves? Why'd you that resource you guys put together was like so in depth, and I love the images, the diagrams and everything. So in depth, so easy to understand. Why did you want to start looking into the calves?
Yeah, I mean it's a good question. It started a while back, and Andy and I were just kind of going back and forth, being like, all right, we feel like there's a little bit of a gap when it comes to these like quality resources out there that are pretty accessible for people to use, and just really give a lot of information on a single topic. Um, to be honest, I thought that the ACL and hamstring and knee and hip areas were just a little bit saturated. You don't want me involved in anything upper extremity related. That's just not my forte. And so I had recently read a paper by Brady Green, which was like a qualitative analysis on how like on different expert opinions essentially when it comes to calf rehab, and it was just such a well written paper that I was like, dang, I could probably read about this stuff forever. And so that kind of kicked off a whole host of just me. Yeah, I feel like everybody in PT and strength conditioning will go down little rabbit holes and deep dives every now and then when they get interested in something. And so that just became like a little passion project. And so at first I typed up like a mini 10 pager, sent it over to Andy, and he was like, this is good. Like, what if we put more detail into it? And I was like, okay. And so then 10 turned to 20 and 30 and 40. And I think now if you get the ebook, it's like 70 pages long of just a bunch of different, anything from anatomy to functional considerations to profiling to, you name it, there's probably something about the calf and Achilles in there. And so, yeah, it was just a really fun resource. It was one of those things where like the more I dug, the more interesting things got. And it was also kind of fit my bias a little bit in that the calf and Achilles area is very biomechanics heavy, which is something that I really like learning about. So yeah, that's kind of the reason. I don't necessarily, like, I never blew my Achilles. I never, like, I've had some calf issues here and there and some basic tendon issues, but it's like by no means something where I was like, I got to figure this out for myself. And then I got interested. It was just kind of a cool topic. Didn't know that there was a lot of information on it otherwise. And so we just said, let's go for it.
Yeah, I got that when I got into the patellar tendon. I felt like there was like 10 times more stuff on the Achilles tendon than there was patellar. Even experts, so many Achilles experts, and like barely any who specialized in patellar. Actually, I can't think of anyone who specialized just in patellar. But you said calves, biomechanics heavy. What do you mean?
It's it's an area like from a biomechanics perspective. Like if you like, I am by no means a biomechanist. I don't like. I've played around with some of the marker motion capture and markerless motion capture tech out there, but um, if you like the way that I kind of rationalize it is the foot is very close to the ground, right? So any ground reaction forces that come through the foot are likely going to go through the foot and ankle. So it makes biomechanics and like very like kinetic centric data a lot easier for people to assess. Now there is new information out there that shows like if you use a rigid foot model in some of the biomechanics studies, it can overestimate the load that goes through the plantar flexors, like the calf and the Achilles, by up to like 40 or 50% or something crazy. So it is one of those things where over time when I say it's biomechanics heavy, it's easier for biomechanists to say this is the load that's going through these areas, and this is what the muscle is doing just because of the research that was out there. In my opinion, the further you get up the quote unquote kinetic chain, it's pretty hard to understand the exact amount of force that's going through the L4 facet joint because it's so high up and there's so many other variables that can dissipate that load beforehand. But considering it's like the ankle joint, it's the calf that's directly like close to the ground, makes it a lot easier to kind of rationalize and say, okay, biomechanics stuff is probably a little bit easier to understand from this point of view.
Okay. I was listening to that Mike Robertson podcast, and you referenced this. We had a phone call yesterday. But you had talked about that many years ago. I had a post on the Jolly Rancher patellar tendon. When it gets pathological, it gets stiffer, and then the Achilles tendon, when it gets pathological, it gets more compliant, and I called it the bubblegum Achilles. I got that from my friend Mike Kozak, bubblegum Achilles. With like high school girls, he would have them do like a split squat, and you could just see their calcaneus would like stay on the ground almost. He was saying, and it's like you could just imagine how they're not getting any activation of their calves or any strain on their Achilles because they're just like afraid to load it or not able to. So anyways, but then, now before the call, we were talking, and I was like, I feel like all the tendons that get pathological become more compliant. So the patellar tendon, Jolly Rancher, is probably referring to the knee. You just move very stiff. You don't want to load the knee, so you move very stiff. But the Achilles, you can't avoid loading it, so it's like you'll just probably have this more compliant type look on the Achilles if you try to load it, and the structure is more compliant. Have you? Okay, so you said there's really the ground reaction forces have to go through the calf and Achilles. Have you kind of thought, is there a way around it? Is there a way to hide? Or is there like, for sure, you cannot hide the calves when you're doing something where you're, say, the sport of basketball or something where your foot is contacting the ground with those forces? Is there any way to hide the calves and Achilles or no?
I mean, the body is smarter than we are for sure, and so I'm sure there's plenty of ways in which they can like decrease the total amplitude or the total amount of force that goes through the area. However, I'd be hard pressed to make the statement that it's like ever zero, right? There's probably never like, unless you're just floating in space or something like that, there's probably never like zero amounts of tension or like anything like that going through the calf. What I've seen with some people that have a hard time, like using their calf, they don't have that kind of reactive strength, that pop off the floor, right? And so they may have that capacity, but it may just be, pain that's limiting them or something like that. So they will tend to push off with like in a relatively like dorsiflex position, if that makes any sense. Like, so there's a metric in force plates that's like vertical displacement at takeoff that I'll pay attention to a lot because it essentially can calculate obviously vertical displacement, and then it measures it right before there's zero force or there's 0 newtons registered on the force plates. And what that if that number is positive, because the reference point is like the reference point is when you're standing normally, flat feet, just casual. And so if that number is positive, it essentially means that your displacement at takeoff means you got up onto your toes and you kind of used your calves a little bit. However, you can essentially monitor and say, well, if your vertical displacement at takeoff is lower, whether it's 0 or just barely above 0, it's almost never going to be negative. It kind of leads me to believe, okay, there may be something else there, that they're not actually pushing through their calves and they're not getting that like last drive off force a lot. You'll also see that shown in like concentric peak power and like those sorts of things, because again, that very last forceful toe off from the calves is like in that very end stage of the counter movement jump, and it's one of the largest contributors to peak power and peak takeoff velocity. So people that don't use their calves well, maybe don't have that little pop in their step. They'll kind of push off in a relatively dorsiflexed position, rather than landing in a dorsiflexed position, which are two different things, I would argue. And then, to be honest, those are probably the only other areas. When it comes to decel, it's really hard to tell whether or not like you're using your calves or not. There's a funny case study, I guess it's not published or anything, but I was chatting with Eric Mara, and he was saying that at one point he was working with some higher profile guy that kept on pulling his calf, but when they tested his calves, they were like incredibly strong, upwards of 2 times body weight. That was clearly not the issue, and so they kept on going on and on and on. I tried to figure something out about like what was happening, and it turned out that when they measured like an isolated knee extension test, he just didn't have a quad. And then when they did like an in-depth biomechanical analysis in like a lab where he did a bunch of decelerations, you could see from ground reaction forces and from the kinematic data that he was essentially just dumping all of the load into his ankle and using his soleus to eccentrically decelerate his body mass. And that's how he was tearing his calf every time, rather than it being like anything else, or him just like not having strong enough calves. And so the irony is Eric is big in the ACL space, and he always says like, it's the quad until it's not the quad. And the irony there is like, even in a calf case for him, it was still the quad. So it's kind of a little bit off topic, but still kind of relevant.
I think he was on Move the Needle, and he was talking about that with the quad, like the soleus can kind of do that job of the quad. What is that? Can you see that with the naked eye? What does that look like?
That's tough when it comes to seeing it with the naked eye. I wouldn't necessarily say that like I have a really good cue of like, oh, this is what's happening. I think you can see it when somebody does it really poorly, if that makes sense. Like you can see if somebody doesn't have a quad and also doesn't have a calf, they'll try and decelerate and immediately get up onto their toes. And then they like kind of like do that weird little stutter step with that front foot where like they don't have enough impulse to break their momentum. So then they have to like do that extra little hop step with that front foot. That in my head is, okay, they don't have enough, like they went through all stops of the hip, the knee, and the ankle trying to decelerate their body mass, but none of those 3 were sufficient enough. So then they had to take that extra step to put that foot further out in front of them so that they could essentially reorient their ground reaction forces. I think that is a good example of, they're just bad at decelerating to begin with. The difficulty with the calves and all that kind of stuff is it's very hard to be able to tell, okay, if you're going into super deep ranges of dorsiflexion, does that mean that you just have no eccentric capacity, you're just loading into the quad and your momentum's going forward? Or does that mean you actually have a really strong calf and know that, at end ranges of dorsiflexion is where you can produce the most amount of force. So you just jump into that position so you know that you could stop. So I think there's not necessarily, like, if you have a really strong quad and a really strong soleus, I don't necessarily think that I have a really good eye for saying, yep, that's exactly what's happening. But if you have, bad quad and bad soleus, then it's pretty easy to spot.
Okay. Explain to me, there's a lot of stuff into the anatomy of the calves, the 2 gastroc muscles, the soleus. What's going on with those 2? How are they functionally different? What's going on when you're doing athletic movements with the soleus, with the gastroc? You could probably explain it for 20 minutes, but give me the elevator pitch.
Yeah, so elevator pitch, I can probably jam through quickly. I think the main characteristics that you have to look at when differentiating muscles are, the fiber type, fiber length, presence or lack of non-contractile structures, i.e. aponeuroses or intramuscular tendons, and then like force characteristics, right? So when you look at soleus, it is about 80% for most individuals, general population, about 80% of the fiber types are oxidative, type 1, meaning it can recover really quickly. And it's, what people would assume to be the quote unquote postural muscle, where it's non-fatiguing, those sorts of things. I think we'd probably question that, because a lot of times people think of postural muscles as, low force, when we know the soleus can produce an insane amount of force. But when we look at soleus, we know, about it's an 80-20 ratio of type 1 to type 2 fibers. The muscle fiber lengths themselves are super short. And that is really beneficial when it comes to being efficient with muscle contractions. It doesn't need to shorten a whole lot to produce a lot of force. Muscle contraction velocities themselves are really short and small, because there's essentially no more room to grow, no more room to go. And then intramuscular tendons, there's 3 of them, which contribute to the length of the muscle fibers themselves. But again, it's one of those things where it's like, okay, if we're trying to be energetically efficient, we're going to be a lot more oxidative in nature. We're going to shorten up the muscle fibers, and we're going to put structures within the muscle that don't require as much energy, right? So in non-contractile tissues, so that we can stave off some of that kind of more energetically demanding contractions, like eccentric contractions and those sorts of things. So Soleus is a lot more biased towards that kind of quote unquote efficiency, based on some of those sort of structural characteristics. When we think about gastrocs, a lot of people will then go, well, Soleus is slow twitch, then gastroc's got to be super fast twitch, which kind of is in relationship, but it's more of a 50-50 distribution. So there is more of that kind of forceful, rapid type 2 fiber distribution, but it's not all of the fibers by any means. Maybe if you're a sprinter and have years of experience doing really fast reactive strength type activities, maybe it's 60-40 bias towards the type 2 fibers, but 50-50 by and large. When it comes to non-contractile tissues within the gastrocs, there's just 2 aponeuroses, one posterior that connects the gastrocs to the knee, and then one that's anterior essentially on the surface of the soleus, if that kind of makes sense. And that creates the kind of gastrocs free tendon that ultimately inserts into the Achilles. So those are the 2 kind of aponeuroses that sandwich the muscle fibers together. And the muscle fibers themselves in the gastrocs are considerably longer, meaning they have to shorten at a faster velocity to produce similar amounts of force. So again, kind of biases them more towards that quote unquote fast twitch. And then lastly, when it comes to force production, the timing and sequencing is kind of important with the calves, where Soleus, when you look at some of like the running kinetic data and modeling data, you'll see Soleus kind of quote unquote turns on earlier on. It provides I wouldn't necessarily call it an eccentric contraction, but like a load attenuating contraction, where there is negative work being done by the muscle tendon unit. And then the more positive work that's being done by the entirety of the calf and Achilles complex, namely comes from a forceful gastrocs toe off towards the later 50% of the stance phase. So the way that I kind of say is the soleus provides a little bit of a springboard for the gastrocs to then take the credit for the really forceful push off. But yeah, I'll stop there. But if we want to go into other areas, more than happy to.
Yeah. Okay. So the well, I mean, the many questions off that, but the one I think of immediately. Okay, when it comes to me, like I think of tendons. I'm thinking of the Achilles tendon or of the patellar, and there's all this work on. Well, recently I've had the distinction of when you talk about a muscle, like muscle hypertrophy, let's say getting signal out of muscle, you have the metabolic pathways, which you can see some adaptation from metabolic pathways, and then you have like the mechanical tension or mechanical tension with the muscle. Those are the 2 pathways I look at of like that's how you can have some adaptation. When it comes to the tendon, the metabolic side, they've done it mostly on like the BFR, and it's just minimal. Like you hardly see adaptation, and I guess the adaptation you're looking for in a tendon is a stiffness gain, and they just don't see it. So that's basically like you need to strain. Like Gerard McMahon had that paper, no strain, no gain. You need to get strain out of the tendon and get length out of the tendon. And the way I look at patellar is like, okay, what is strain? Strain is going to be how hard the muscle's pulling, and then what is the starting length of the patellar tendon. So like a very extended patellar tendon is a starting length where it's kind of crimped. So like if you go to a mid-range, it's already bent, and then you're going to get a big muscle contraction. You're going to get a lot of strain, a lot of adaptation. And then with the Achilles, I've looked at it and I've been like, okay, if you go to deep dorsiflexion and you lift a really heavy load, that's probably going to be a lot of Achilles tendon strain. So you're going to get more adaptation. That explanation you just gave of like the soleus being more slow twitch and having all these aponeurosis, and then the gastrocs being more fast twitch. Do you train we don't have to speak specifically to the tendon, maybe to the muscle. Does that alter the way that you would train them in the weight room? Would you do like gastrocs, heavier loads, lower reps, soleus, higher reps, lower weights, or is that not really a thing to you?
It's a good question, and I think a lot of times most of the training options that are there kind of already dictate how the muscles operate. And so what I mean by that is like yes, there's like Matt McInnes Watson and those guys like with plus plyos like do a really good job of changing up a lot of the plyometric demand through like deep tier like contractions and executions of jumps and those sorts of things. So taking those sorts of things aside, if you think about like old school traditional plyometric training, most of the time you're going to be fully extending the knee joint, fully plantar flexing, going through those types of ranges of motion. And so like with a lot of those fast twitch dynamic activities, you're going to have that triple extension action. So you're inherently like the gastroc is going to be there. The demand for, if you want to execute the task, quote unquote, correctly, then you're going to need to like essentially have high force and high rate of force development within those structures. So I would say it's not necessarily that I'm thinking, oh, this is a soleus thing, therefore we need to, train it slow and heavy. Like that does happen. But I would still do a very similar approach, or I would say I would do a similar distribution of loads, whether that's like heavy and slow, lighter and fast, heavy and fast, like whatever that distribution is. I would likely do something relatively similar with gastrocs, whether it's with soleus. I think where I start to change things more is rather it being the muscle itself, it's the tissue itself. So if it's like a pure muscle strain, there's no aponeurotic involvement, there's no intramuscular tendon involvement, just pure muscle strain, that's going to change the way I would load something versus if it does have aponeurosis involvement or intramuscular tendon involvement, right? We know that with intramuscular tendons, specifically in the soleus, right, they when there is even like an intramuscular tendon rupture, the separation in there is not that long, right? There's not a large separation of like the two ends of the tendon or the tendon that's split, and so you essentially can be a little, not necessarily more aggressive, because in these scenarios, pain is never really the limiting factor. There's this really interesting study where I think it was Craig Purdom and like a colleague of his just like shoved a 20 plus gauge needle into somebody's calf just to see if there was like sensation to different structures. And they just like blew through the central intramuscular tendon of the soleus. And the person was like, nah, I like didn't feel any different than anything else. And so like we know based on that and based on others, the presentation of soleus strains, even if they're very severe, is not going to have a really high pain response. So when we know that there's intramuscular tendon involvement, then it changes the way in which I'm going to operate to saying, let's focus on making sure that we provide a quality healing environment if these two ends of the tendon are going to approximate and form some type of a callus. And then within that healing environment, try and make sure that we have some level of load communicating through those areas so that we can have better tissue remodeling in a more effective manner, rather than just having like this clump of a callus that then just sits within the muscle that doesn't is no longer functional, right? So, whereas if we then take let's take a gastrocs muscle strain, like maybe at the muscle tendon junction or somewhere similar, in those scenarios, so long as it's tolerable, I will likely go quicker into more dynamic activities, whether it's sled pushes, whether it's like band assisted pogos or things like that, just so that we can get some of those sorts of faster reactive strength type qualities back into that muscle, because the tissue healing process is likely going to be a little bit accelerated, and we know that those are similar demands for the terminal task of whatever sport they're working in. So it's not necessary. I guess I did give the example of soleus versus gastroc, but it wasn't necessarily because it was those two muscles. It was because of the structures within those muscles, if that makes sense.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So those aponeurosis injuries, like if someone has a soleus or gastroc strain, you would have it's worthwhile to get image to see what it is,
Yeah, it
whether
definitely
it's
depends.
aponeurosis
Like,
or muscle.
yeah, so I mean, like it's tough, right? Like we're in the States. It's pretty rough to like get an MRI approved for like an index, soleus strain if you're not an elite athlete or something like that. So by no means am I saying that, we should be ordering imaging on any sore calf there is, because it's kind of difficult to tell when a soleus is truly torn, because they'll just say, it feels sore. So in those cases, if we know that they have a recurrent history of having calf strains or things like that, then it makes me think, okay, maybe we either go like obviously MRI is great, but maybe we go ultrasound. Maybe we just see if we can find something that would indicate, okay, there's more non-contractile tissue involvement, because we know that the second there's either aponeurosis or intramuscular tendon involvement in a strain injury, we know return to play times are going to be increasingly delayed. So it means that we either need to respect tissue healing time and go a little bit slower, or it just means that we need to understand the specific area in the soleus, whether it's the central intramuscular tendon, the lateral, or the medial, see if there's some loading strategies that we can use to bias one or the other. So there's some suggestions out there. There's no like hard and fast data to suggest exactly like if you put your foot in this position, then the lateral soleus is going to kick on. There is some data that shows that there are like I think there's like 7 different neural compartments within the soleus. So there could be changes in firing depending on recruitment and position and all those sorts of things. I know Craig Purdham's put some stuff out there on like if you float the medial toes off while you do some type of an action and externally rotate the foot, then you, in theory, would get more contraction from the medial side of the soleus, and then vice versa. If you float the lateral toes off of like a plate and then internally rotate the foot a little bit, then you might get more recruitment of the lateral or the lateral soleus. But at the same time, like we don't have like really high quality data to suggest that there's like hypertrophic changes biasing a certain region of the soleus, at least that I'm aware of.
Oh, on the hypertrophic on the soleus.
Yeah, like I don't know of any data to
Okay.
suggest like a region of the soleus that is preferentially like
Okay, yeah.
hypertrophied from a certain type of an exercise.
Yeah. Gastrocs though? Have you seen it with gastrocs?
Yeah, I think there was like some like bodybuilding paper or something like that showed like a change based on foot position, and I think they almost showed something slightly. No, I think it was somewhat similar. Like if you externally rotate the foot, then the medial gastroc will turn on a little bit more, and you internally rotate the foot, the lateral gastroc will turn on a little bit more. I very well could be wrong on that. It's been a while since I read that paper. As you can probably tell, it's not something that I immediately like jump to as like it's a medial gastroc strain. That means we need to always have the foot externally rotated. But again, it's information for practitioners to update their processes and say, let's test it out. Certainly it's a do no harm situation, right? Where it's like if you externally rotate the foot while you're doing a calf raise, well, you're still loading the calf, so like you're doing something right. But you could be more specific, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of is there another muscle in the body that has the amount of aponeurosis the soleus does?
It's a good question. Like the number of the content there could. I mean, like bicep fem does have some like, especially if you combine short and long head and all that kind of stuff, there's definitely a good amount of aponeurotic involvement there. Like the rec fem like has a really long intramuscular tendon, right? That's why it has that little like feathered appearance and stuff. So that also could be something, but it's the soleus is definitely unique. There's this really interesting paper. I forget. I posted about it on Instagram like 2 years ago or something, where it's like I call it like the soleus is a performance outlier, because what it did was it looked at, it was like cross sectional area, or maybe like force potential and fiber length as like the graph, and they plotted a bunch of different muscles, and like all these muscles were kind of clustered almost in a similar pattern to like what the force velocity relationship looks like. And then soleus was just like way out on the right hand side and like a little bit higher than everybody else's or all the other like muscles as well. It was just like a really interesting way of saying like soleus can handle a ton and a ton of really high loads, as well as has really short fibers, so it's incredibly efficient at doing so. So yeah, it was an interesting paper.
Mm. Okay, I want to ask this before I forget. I asked you yesterday on a phone call, because I've had that question before. People say, "Oh, the high calves, really high gastrocs, and then long Achilles tendon typically better athletes, more explosive, reactive, elastic, whatever it is. But I've always been like, well, there's a huge soleus underneath that you're not seeing. And like that has a big contributor. Anyways, yeah, is there anything to that? This whole like really high gastrocs, really long looking Achilles tendon. What does that mean for like athleticism?
It's a really good question. I don't think I have like a perfect explanation. There's a paper that was released a couple months back that had a comparison between like this East African tribe called like the Maasai tribe and like these like typical European controls. And so if anybody's familiar or has seen like these videos, they're on YouTube or Instagram or wherever. But this tribe specifically like has these really interesting I don't know how to characterize it, but like it's almost like a dance where they're all in a circle, there's music playing, and they just have this insane amount of reactive strength. Like these people are just bouncing off of their feet in the whole time. No shoes, no controlled environment, just like on dirt with, I'm sure, rocks and stuff around. And it's like it appears to be something that's like very like deep within their culture of like it's something that they're celebrating and something that they enjoy, and so I'm sure it's just something that all of them have done their entire lives, and obviously I'm sure their predecessors have done for their entire lives as well, and so there might be some genetic factors there, but in that paper they showed that those individuals also had that really high gastrocs and really long Achilles tendon. The way I would think about it is we take the idea of like a certain amount of strain, a percentage of strain. Let's call it 10% strain for the ease of math. And then let's say somebody like in a normal, typical person who doesn't have that balled up gastroc has an Achilles tendon that's 30 centimeters long. That's pretty long, but we'll just say 30 centimeters. It's 10% strain of 30 centimeters is 3 centimeters. So that means they go from 30 to 33 centimeters, right? So that's 3 centimeters of strain. If you take the same amount of strain, 10%, but you increase the length of that tendon, and you call it 40 centimeters. Well, now that 3 centimeters of strain turns to 4 centimeters of strain because 10% of 40 is 4. So when you have that shorter and shorter and shorter muscle belly, you could get the same amount of strain from a percentage or a relative perspective, but absolute amounts of strain are going to be greater, right? So they could, even if they have the same levels of strain, could be quote unquote more efficient at using their tendons because there is more strain going through that area. Now, I also fully agree with you in that, like, there's a massive soleus underneath that. So whether or not that is the thing that is happening, who knows? We also know that when you have that balled up or that really short gastrocs, the portion from where the gastrocs ends to where the Achilles tendon starts, right? There's that tendinous tissue, but it's not fully characterized as the Achilles tendon yet because the soleus hasn't finished its deal, essentially. So people will call that a couple different things: the gastrocs free tendon, the gastrocs run out. Sometimes they'll call it the anterior gastrocs aponeurosis because it's kind of continuous with that structure as well. We know from some papers by Carlos Pidre, excuse me, that when those areas are injured, again, return to play times are elongated. So that could very well be a really high, performance potential area in that we just haven't really figured out what the dynamics are. We know that there's going to be considerable levels of shear force between that kind of anterior surface of the gastrocs and the posterior surface of the soleus when one contracts and the other doesn't, i.e. in like a bent knee position where soleus is turned on a lot, but gastrocs is shortchanged. So you have this like balled up muscle underneath a really lax muscle. And then if you picture something like acceleration, where you have that, you land in a like pretty deep knee bend and then fully extend out, you have that balled up muscle, the soleus. And then as that knee extends, the gastroc starts to wake up and turn on. Then you can see how like that balled up on soft, then that soft structure of the gastrocs like becomes a lot more tense. That shear force could implicate some issues. We see that with plantaris issues and a plantaris tendon, whether it's a rupture or whether it's a just kind of irritation of that tendon. That's where the plantaris runs, is in between soleus and gastrocs. And in that case, right there could be some of that kind of friction or separation between those two muscles when there's too much edema or too much fluid that accumulates between there, which could be a reason. This is speculation, but it could be a reason why plantaris issues are just so freaking annoying, is because it's like the plantaris is just there. It doesn't really contribute functionally all that much, I should say, but it definitely can get injured more so than what people probably already believe. And so it could just create some of like this separation force or this, like retraction force between the two muscles. I kind of went off on a tangent and to be honest, I already forgot your question. So if you want to rein me back in, feel free. But that's kind of where my
Okay,
brain goes.
yeah, it was on the high. No, you answered it. It was on the high gastroc thing,
But yeah.
being more athletic. And yeah, I've never heard anyone talk about, because when they talk about strain, it's always that percentage. It's
Hmm.
always the percentage of the resting length of the tendon versus how much you can actually pull it. And yeah, I've never heard anyone talk about the absolute strain. What does it mean for the absolute strain if the tendon is already a long tendon?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm
But
sure there's
but
also
I
like,
it could actually be semantics, because I think strain is like what it is dimensionless, or there's a term that
mm,
strain has certain
whoa,
guidelines. So it's like, yeah, so maybe like if we start to say, and maybe that's not the right term, but maybe strain is like, maybe there needs to be a different word, because I think
hmm,
strain just is strain. It doesn't account for how long, if the tendon is 100 centimeters to start with or 10 centimeters, we're just going to stretch it 4%. That's what we're after. But when it comes to something that you just said is like, maybe, yeah, if the tendon is longer, then it's going to be a 4% strain. It's going to strain way longer than a short tendon, and you're probably going to get this more like uh, pulling of the coil and then a recoiling action. So, I mean, it right now makes common sense. Yeah.
yeah, and it could be something similar too. Like again, you're much more knowledgeable when it comes to the patellar area, but like if you have like patella alta versus patella baja, right? That inherently would have a longer patellar tendon versus a shorter patellar tendon. So like, who knows if that has any implication as well of like how to measure things. If you have that quote unquote longer patellar tendon, is that individual inherently going to be a quote unquote better jumper or something along those lines? Like I have no idea. But there's applications of that idea, not just within the calves, but like you could probably apply that somewhere else too.
Okay. Yeah, I've never thought of that. All I've ever heard with patella alta is like, you probably don't want it because you're probably gonna
Yeah.
get some patellar tendon pathology and then some patellofemoral issues if that thing's like not sitting in the groove well. The Okay, I'm thinking, and tell me how off I am here, because I know you probably, I'm just not so much in the calf world. So that soleus kind of has that slow twitch, and it's like, okay, could you? I have a question, but later, maybe if you could explain this. If you take like the gait cycle when you're running, is the soleus is pretty active like early on, and then like really late? Is that when the gastroc is taking over, when you're getting more toe off, or how does it work?
Yeah, it's generally I would say it's a pretty easy heuristic to follow. Like it Soleus generally comes on earlier in the stance, probably just before the 50% marker of stance phase, maybe a little bit earlier, maybe a little bit later, depending on the person's gait mechanics, right? If you're a super knee flexed, runner versus, if you're a little bit springier. There's some evidence from like a French group in 2016. I think it was like Saint-On or whatever, and colleagues. They did like an Alter G like treadmill running, and they did some like EMG stuff, and so they showed that soleus has a very similar recruitment pattern to the vasti or the gas or the quads. So there's another kind of, when we were talking about deceleration previously, there is a known mechanism of how soleus and gas and quads are kind of synergist when it comes to that like ground contact deceleration position. So a heuristic that somebody could follow that's, probably not completely accurate, but good enough, is soleus is likely helpful for decelerating the shank during that eccentric or quote unquote eccentric dorsiflexion position. And then the gastroc kind of turns on and twitches so that you can get into that, quick springy plantar flexion drive off.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. So these was it Maasai? That was the group that was doing the
Mm-hmm.
jumping.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I've seen the video, and it's like the shallow knee bend. Like they're hardly
Mm-hmm.
bending their knees and they're springing off. So when you look at a jump like that, that would be, what's the soleus doing? Is it mostly a gastroc heavy jump, or what do you think it is?
That's a really good question. So to be honest, like I'll start with this by saying I have no idea. I can speculate. But what the soleus is probably doing is just holding on for dear life. So like what I had mentioned before of like the structural characteristics of soleus, the way I interpret that is, when you have such short fibers, you have so many intramuscular, structures that aren't contractile. Your fiber type is 80%, oxidative. This the muscle architecture is like almost screaming out, like, just don't give me an eccentric contraction. Like, I'm gonna do anything possible to avoid that energetically demanding eccentric contraction. And we see that with rebound jumps and reactive strength things. There's a paper in 2006 or 2007 from Souza and colleagues where they did drop jumps and measured Soleus EMG, I believe, or did inverse dynamics to like assess what Soleus recruitment would be, and they looked at it, and only at quote unquote supramaximal jump heights or drop heights, I should say, did the Soleus produce or incur an eccentric contraction, right? So it was isometric to concentric or something similar for all of these jump heights or all these drop landings from, probably 10 centimeters to 15 centimeters to 20. They kept on measuring. They essentially, if you're familiar with what a drop jump profile is, they did that where you just slowly increase the jump heights and you calculate either ground reaction forces, ground contact times, RSI, whatever the metric you want. But once they hit a load or a height in which their then rebound jump was no longer quote unquote optimal, kind of forget what they decided was optimal or not, they saw that the soleus began to have an eccentric contraction. So the way I interpret that is, if you're doing a drop jump profile with somebody, which is something that I've started to do a little bit more, when you find that threshold where their ground contact time exponentially increases, which is normally one of the goals for people to do a drop jump profile so that they can find a quality drop height for somebody to execute training from, that might just be an indicator that that increase in ground contact time is due to like an eccentric calf contraction because it was too much load for the calf to tolerate. So they spent extra time on the ground to be able to decelerate their momentum and then reaccelerate upwards in a quote unquote less efficient manner. So that's probably my interpretation of what would happen when they're doing those really high springy jumps, is that they're just incredibly efficient at something when it comes to the contraction type within the calf. Maybe they can tolerate eccentric contractions really well for some reason, or maybe they're just really good at ignoring or staving off the eccentric and just clamping down with their soleus and just shoving a bunch of load into the tendon. That would be my speculation, but none of that's probably completely accurate.
Okay, I had this some of these seminars I've spoken at, I have these ideas on tendon development, and a lot of it's done when you're a child. And I think it's just straining, like it's just straining the tendon cyclically off and on, pulling on the tendon and then letting it, so straining and then crimping, strain, crimp, or slack, just goes back and forth. But I had this thought of like, if you have an ultimate strain, say it's like 15%, and that's where you're going to rupture the Achilles tendon. What if you're straining at 10% and you just do that like for tons of volume? That's probably a very healthy stimulus for the tendon to like maintain it. And then once you get up to like 12, 13%, you're really doing something max effort. I'm like, that's probably where like the danger comes if you're doing that a lot. With this question, because you were on Mike Robertson's and you were talking about when you're running, like when you're just jogging, the soleus is already like what, 6 times body weight, and then it gets up to like 8 times body weight when you get faster. How do you look at how are you looking at, is like long distance running, if you're not a long distance runner, you just want to have healthy calves and Achilles, is there a point to doing like tons of volume of like lower, it's already so high when you're jogging, but like it is a difference with 6 to 8, if that's the number, 6 to 8 times body weight. Like if you're staying at 6 times body weight and you're just getting that for like a few hours, is there like a really good stimulus to maintain calves and Achilles? What do you need to be doing that? How do you look at that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because like it's one of these things where like it definitely goes against what a lot of times people would assume from a training standpoint of an endurance muscle. So you do light load and a lot of repetition so that you could quote unquote build that endurance, right? Like muscular endurance from the like statistical analyses. Like there's a thing called the principal component analysis where like you'll assess different metrics and see if they're correlated or not. And then it kind of, if you assess enough of them, they create these different clusters of metrics that then group around a certain quality. And so like it's a really helpful way of understanding if a quality is independent of another one. So like, is peak force, if you just hammer peak force and max strength, does it improve muscular endurance over time? Because sometimes people would argue that. Similarly, if you just hammer on muscular endurance, would that ultimately improve your strength? A lot of times, depending on the tests and depending on how they measure it, most of the time when people do those analyses, they see that those are different characteristics. So like you can't just do one and assume that there's going to be carryover for the other. So there's a little bit of a tangent, but hopefully it makes sense now. So you're right, 6 times body weight at like jogging, right? I think it was like 5 meters per second was like what they measured. And then when you're an elite sprinter and you're running at 9 meters per second or something like that, then it gets to that 8 times body weight or even higher sometimes. Whereas with the hamstrings, which is what people also always think about with high speed running, it's super low and it has this kind of like exponential curve upwards as you get faster and faster and faster. So similarly with the calves, what they see when it comes to like the total tensile force production characteristics with Soleus, you will with each step it incurs about 85% of its peak force characteristics or its peak force capacity. So again, it's like people would largely assume from like generic meathead strength and conditioning, 85% is within the strength building percentages of a 1 rep max area. You'd probably be doing anywhere between 4 and 6 or 7 reps of that if you're going hard. So it's like, okay, cool. We can't do 80 reps, or like you can't really do that many of something that's that hard. So what I'm a big fan of when it comes to training the calf is doing things like cluster sets, right? So it allows you to accumulate a little bit more volume with heavier loads. If anyone's not familiar, cluster set would be like, let's say you want to do 12 reps of something. What you do is you just break that up into like mini sets within the set of 12. So you do 3 sets of 4 so that you can give yourself like a 30-second rest and then get back after it. That I have found is kind of a really good way to kind of blend a little bit, even though I'm probably contradicting what I just said about the strength domains of like, you can't have peak force and strength endurance. That's kind of my way of cheating the system a little bit, where like if you can find that 85% 1 rep max and do a set of 4, rest 30 seconds, do another set of 4, rest 30 seconds, and then I do a final set of 4 and see if you can get to that 12 rep mark. These are all arbitrary numbers. It's not like this is like a perfect strength benchmark, but that is definitely something that from a training perspective I would encourage if you're a runner. Most of the time runners and just people in general don't train their calves to begin with. Like it's not like people are going to the gym, especially if you're a runner. Like the runners that I work with a lot of times will say, yeah, like I run and then I go to the gym. It's like, what do you do in the gym? It's like, well, I'll do like a trap bar deadlift and then I like bench and do curls because I'm already working my legs out when I'm running. I'm like, okay, yeah, you're not wrong, but like you're also not going to set yourself up for success. So that's kind of the way I think about training and preparing for that kind of longer endurance area is, you still need to achieve high forces and heavy loads. And so you could do that through isometrics. You can do that through eccentrics, right? If you get into a Smith machine and just like go to town, do 2 up, 1 down of a really heavy load, it's a great way to help stimulate some of that, tensile capacity. But you also still will need to have some level of endurance. And that's where I start to bake in some of the cluster sets, because doing 100 reps with a 15-pound kettlebell on your knee is not going to do anything for you. So you got to find some kind of, intermediary.
I think you've talked about this before. I think it was in your book too about I think it's the standing calf endurance test. Does that ring a bell? Yeah. How do you look at, what's the point of that? And then I've told so many people, I'm like, they have like normative data that's useful, and I've just never like pulled it up myself. Yeah, is that something like I'm thinking of someone like a distance runner? I would think like the strength endurance of their calves is probably fine, but then I've heard if you put them on the standing calf raise test, a lot of them suck.
Yeah. So it's another great example of like they're very different contractions when you're like doing muscular work versus like tendinous work, I guess is the way I kind of conceptualize it, right? Work being force times distance, like from a physics sense. When you're running, again, a lot of the contractions within these sorts of like, through most speeds of running is going to be an isometric contraction within the calves, and then a large like stretch shortening cycle amplitude within the Achilles, which is going to be a lot of the driving force. Right. So then when you think about that, you're like, oh, okay, well, like you're not doing a whole lot of muscular work within the calf and within the soleus and gastrocs that's just clamping down, dumping load into the Achilles, and then using that as the propulsive force. So then when you go to and like actually have to do a quality eccentric and concentric contraction, well, your body's like, well, I use this muscle, but I don't use it in this way, and so that's why it's difficult. When it comes to like standardizing that that task, I guess, or that assessment. Brady Green and a couple other people did a paper a while ago. Maybe it was just like a poster presentation or something, but they did two comparison groups of like a constrained version of the assessment and an unconstrained of like self-select your height, your speed, all of these sorts of things. And the people that did that got, 40 reps or something like that. And the people that had to do it in an isolated fashion of you have to go to at least 10 degrees of dorsiflexion. So you have to go to a deficit. You have to go like you have a 1-0-1-0 tempo of 1 second up, 1 second down, no rest at the top or bottom. You can't have any contribution from your hands, but you can rest your fingertips on a wall for balance. And then your alignment of the foot is, the center of pressure is within the second ray, right? So the toe next to your big toe. There's probably another, couple things. Oh, and then you have to maintain the same heel height. So they set heel height by you doing a double leg heel raise, and they check how high your heel gets, and then that is your kind of threshold. So the previous group that didn't have any of those constraints on them, they could do, I can't remember what the number was, maybe it was like 35 or something, but the other group could only do like 22 when it's constrained. Well, so it's obvious that you need to do the assessment well in order for it to be effective. So if you follow those guidelines of what I mentioned, you're probably getting some amount of strength endurance load into the calves. And if you can hit that 30 repetition number, then it's probably a good maintenance for you to be able to do on you can test yourself every month or something like that if it's meaningful to you as a runner. However, I would also just still urge that like you are not done yet if you can just do 30 calf raises. Like you still need to make sure that you are doing really heavy work within the calves because they withstand a lot of load.
Mm-hmm. And that standing calf raise test, that's not off a step, that's like on the ground, just flat ground.
Well, yeah, so you have to go to like a 10-degree dorsiflexion deficit. So whether that's a plate, whether that's an incline, they do whatever you have in the clinic or in the gym or wherever it is that you're at. You could do it off of a step. It's just normally what people will try to do is use an equivalent plate so that right when their heel taps down, it's at that 10 degrees or 15 degrees or whatever you set as your benchmark, and then consistently use the same plate each time and all that kind of stuff. Because a lot of times people will be like, oh yeah, I did it one day and I used like a slant board, and the next day I used a 45-pound bumper plate, and the next day I used, whatever it was to create the deficit. And believe it or not, it will probably change your ability to do the test. Not by a ton, but maybe a rep or two.
Okay. I personally, I have my patellar tendon plan. So if people get patellar tendon pain, I'm just like, here's the plan. I have so many people that do phone consults with Achilles tendon pain, or they just want like to avoid Achilles tendon issues. And I'm like, well, let's just like thoroughly train the calves. And I give some like heavy standing, probably maybe a little different with the seated, and then that standing calf raise test I'd like to. What are you doing if someone comes to you and it's like you're just, I don't know how many days a week, if it's like 2-3 days a week of calf training, here's what I think is thorough calf training. What does that look like for you?
It's a really good question. I think you have to remove, like, you have to approach it like an S&C coach, like trying to periodize a squat plan or something like that, in my opinion. Because I think a lot of times people will look at the calf and, to be honest, like I'll be the first person to say there's not a ton of options when it comes to calf loading, right? It's a pretty simple or relatively simple way in which you can load it because it's hard to hide from. But I think because of that, people will then just say, I'll do a standing calf raise and I'll do a seated calf raise and I'll call it a day, which for some people could very well be the stimulus that they need if they haven't done anything previously, right? So I'm a big fan of doing as little as possible. Like minimum effective dosage is the name of the game, in my opinion. But if you wanted a super robust plan and you wanted to plan out, like I mentioned, like a S&C coach would try and increase a 1-rep max squat or something. If you have 2 days a week that you have dedicated to training, I would say one day would be focused more on like heavy, slow stuff, and one day would be focused on, lighter, faster stuff. So heavy, slow, Nothing all that crazy, but making sure that you do a really solid seated soleus or soleus based seated calf raise. And what I mean by that is making sure you can get, as long as it's tolerable for the individual, get into some level of end range dorsiflexion. If you can tolerate complete end range, then go for it. If you can't, then just find the maximum level of dorsiflexion that's tolerable for you at the moment, especially if you have like a this is barring any other injury. Obviously, I think a lot of people listening to this podcast would know if you have an insertional Achilles issue, like probably don't cram into end range dorsiflexion early on. But I would go, end range dorsiflexion, make it heavy enough to the point where you can't complete even the first rep, right? You can get from end range to maybe mid range of like neutral, and then you'd have to come back down, because we know that from, force curves and all these sorts of things, that's where the calf can produce the most amount of force. And we also know can speculate from hamstring data and those sorts of things that maybe end range or long lever strengthening can potentially be beneficial from a muscular strain perspective, of preventing some of those injuries. So doing something like that, doing a similar pattern with a standing heel raise. I would urge most people to do it in something like a Smith machine if they have it, just because it takes balance out of the equation. You go single leg standing, go to a deficit, push off as high as you can. Hopefully that's a little bit like at neutral ankle position, like not dorsiflexion or plantar flexion, but just neutral, or a little bit into plantar flexion is probably fine. And then structure rep schemes accordingly to whatever the quality is that you're trying to improve. If it's a heavy, slow day, then you're probably going to do, peak force focused things. So, don't be afraid to go to failure at rep 8, right? Or something like that, or rep 6. Like doing sets of 6 calf raises is actually a really helpful thing. And then I'm a big fan of doing some type of isometric training afterwards, right? So, that you can kind of play around with. You can change the angles of, you can use slant boards. I'm a big fan of putting a slant board down in a squat rack, so that when you put one foot on it, it biases it towards eversion, right? So like your calcaneus kind of dumps medially, you're quote unquote pronating, but you're on your forefoot. That would probably deliver, like in theory, could deliver a little bit more strain to the medial side of the tendon, which could be beneficial considering some of the tendon world stuff that goes on when it comes to mid portion Achilles tendinopathy and those sorts of things. But don't be afraid to play around with it, and change the angles, change the vectors. I have yet to find a way to do a really high quality lateral pushing isometric. A lot of times you'll see people like leaning up against a wall and then driving with their foot, and it looks great. Personally, I have yet to find a way that I can do it and actually feel like I'm exerting enough force into the ground for it to be sufficient load into my calf. And then the second, if somebody says, well, we'll just put a slant board there so you can push, that takes away the point of having that lateral force, right? So doing something there. And then on the other day, if it's fast and twitchy, the only thing that I would think that would be relevant to talk about besides just basic plyometric and quality training that way, would be the use of sleds. If you're a more advanced individual and like don't have an injury history, doing essentially single leg jumping with a like moderately light medium load sled, you will either tear your Achilles or you'll just make yourself have like the strongest calf ever, in my opinion, because being able to exert a lot of force in that kind of acceleration type position, end range dorsiflexion, pushing against a really heavy or moderately heavy load, and essentially having that cyclical pattern, is something that is very beneficial as long as it's tolerated.
Yeah. Okay. So those calf raises, you're just going like dorsiflexion to mid range,
Yeah.
regardless of the set and rep scheme. So you don't really care about getting plantar flexion.
Yeah, so it depends. Not necessarily regardless of set and rep scheme. If the set and rep scheme is muscular endurance, then I'm fine if they go into end range plantar flexion. But I don't stop the endurance test. Like if it's endurance, I shouldn't say endurance test. If it's endurance like S&C work, right? And we're just doing it to drive a stimulus to create change, then I don't tell the person stop when you can't get full height. You just keep going, right? But it's okay if you start to lose a little bit of plantar flexion height. The reason why I allow that from an endurance standpoint is because you're allowing more muscular work, right? There's more distance that person has to cover, right? And so if you're applying that same force and distance, algorithm for muscular work, then you're creating more work for the muscle, which is beneficial. I'll use like that strategy is normally what I'll do at the end of a session. I'll slap on some BFR cuffs and I'll just have that person go to town. Not for no other reason than a lot of times if you're working with a runner or with a track athlete or with somebody who or even basketball, where somebody wants to feel like they did a hard workout. It's more of like, hey, the BFR is great and it has some unique benefits on its own, and it makes it easier on us to do so. But it's not like, oh my gosh, you have to absolutely do this type of a set and rep scheme with this type of a limb occlusion pressure and all those sorts of things. It's more just like, hey, let's empty the tank. Let's go for it. That's something that I know you had Jess Ellis on recently. I've had some conversations with him, but like he's a big fan of just, hey, slap some BFR cuffs on at the end of the session and empty the tank a bit, just because it helps to kind of just feel like he did something.
Yeah. The how are you? So you had this distinction of running is going to be the work done by the tendon, the extending of the tendon and the muscles kind of isometric, versus the lifting. You're trying to get that work done by the muscle. How are you like thinking you're ensuring that? Are you like focusing on slower tempos, or are you okay with things being a little faster when it comes to lifting?
Yeah, for sure. So it depends, like I was saying before, if we're structuring like the day to be more like peak force centric, then I'm likely trying to make sure that the tissues that can generate peak forces, i.e. muscles, are the things that are getting the load and adaptation. So heavy slow is great. And can change the tempo on a like quote unquote faster day. That where we'd be doing plyos, we'd be doing skipping, jumping, a lot of reverse like drop catches where you land in a planet or in a heel up position and puts a lot of load there. There, obviously, it's going to be a quasi isometric or even concentric related contraction within the calves, dumps more load into the Achilles, right? So like we still want to make sure that we're uh, playing both sides of the field to a certain degree. Like we want to get change tempo so that muscles can do their thing and they can actually get some sort of adaptation. But we also want to make sure that you're not just increasing muscular force production and not paying attention to tendon health either. Granted, slower, heavier stuff will inherently benefit tendon work as well. But you also want to make sure that you can kind of slowly grade people back into that high amplitude or high rate of force development activities. Been a big fan of playing around with some of like the pulses that Craig Purdham's done recently. By no means are they like an end all be all, but like overloading a pulse, I've found, like I did that earlier this week. It's Friday. I think I did that on Tuesday and my calves are still sore. So like just, I got a heavy kettlebell and just held onto it, used another hand to just support my weight so that I didn't, rock too much. And then just did really heavy pulses in like, end to mid range dorsiflexion and just ruined my calves, which was great.
The God, I feel like I'm a little bit in the calf and Achilles world, but I feel like I see a lot of plantar flexion. I get it when you're doing like coming back from a rupture. You want to restore plantar flexion because it's like a difficult quality to get back. But outside of that, it seems like there's this. It's like the bodybuilding purists of like rep. The reps don't look clean. You're not doing like a full depth squat. If you were to do a calf raise from dorsiflexion to mid range, the average gym goer at like LA Fitness would look at you like, what are you doing? Like that's stupid. Do the full rep, Yeah, what do you look at from mid range to plantar flexion? Is it just kind of a garbage zone, or what do you think it is?
It's a really tough question because like I don't, by no means do I want to just say, yeah, like completely ignore that. But we just know from like if you take either if you have an isometric testing setup, you can do multiple isometric assessments in different positions of the of levels of dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, or if you have an isokinetic machine, you can just do like an eccentric concentric assessment, or just look in the research and there's plenty of them. We know that the second you cross past zero and go into plantar flexion from dorsiflexion, your ability to produce force out of the calves is just terrible, pretty much. So the reason why I go down the road of going into end range dorsiflexion is being able to then withstand the loads that are relevant for the task. I think, like you said, with with an Achilles rupture, yes, end range plantar flexion is likely something that's beneficial. but also it's like you said, it is something that it's helpful because it's a difficult thing to get back, but is it inherently something that is beneficial for an individual? I don't know. That's up to like whatever their task is. If they're a dancer, if they're like in ballet, then yeah, it's very important for them to be able to get into that end range plantar flexion. So it's definitely something you'd work on with that population. If you're just like like in the areas that I work in, when it comes to like like high speed runners or basketball or team sport, like it's not something that I'm immediately concerned with. It's still something that would be nice to get back and restore. But if it's not coming along the way that we think, then I'm not too worried. I will use that as a proxy to work on it earlier stages in rehab, right? So like if you tear your calf, let's say, what I will do sometimes is put some like NMES electrodes on the calf and put them in a prone position, so they're lying on their stomach, and their calf is then kind of forced into plantar flexion, so that it shortchanges all of the muscles within the calf, so that they can't produce a whole lot of force. And then we let the NMES do its thing. Cramps can happen, but if they can like tolerate some level of contraction within that area, we know that we're getting some amount of load through an injured site that should be beneficial, like early loading for tissue remodeling, but not so much because we're inherently limiting the muscle to produce a lot of force because of the length tension relationship of muscle. So that's also a benefit of like kind of working on end range plantar flexion earlier on and using that as an early goal, because we know that the muscle probably can't tolerate heavy loads anyways. So that's a way you could think about it or rationalize. But to be honest, it's not like a really critical KPI of mine when it comes to calf and Achilles rehabs.
Okay, talking about the muscles working, not working. I think maybe like a decade ago, I was like I would do standing calf raises for the gastroc and seated for the soleus, and then it was like, well, actually, you're getting soleus in both. It's just that the gastrocs work less in the seated. And I feel like recently someone was saying that was like kind of overstated, how poor the gastrocs work in the seated. Maybe I'm making that up. Maybe it was in a dream. I swear I saw something like that. What's going on with seated versus standing calf raises in terms of the gastrocs and the soleus?
Yeah, this is definitely a question I get a lot, and I think it's valid. I also think like I don't know. I think that this topic blew up probably like a year and a half ago. There was like a hypertrophy paper from some Japanese researchers, I think it was, that was just like, oh yeah, like soleus hypertrophy is essentially is not statistically different when you do a standing calf raise versus a seated if you use the same like loading structure and those sorts of things. Whereas obviously gastroc hypertrophy is going to change. I can totally understand that. And again, I did talk about minimum effective dosage. If you don't have a history of these sorts of injuries and just want to make sure that you're loading your calves, once or twice a week, sure, go and do the standing seated or the standing calf raise. Just make sure you're doing it heavy enough in accordance to the parameters we talked about before. Um, at the same time, though, like there's a lot of benefit, in my opinion, to doing a seated calf raise. It's likely more comfortable for people, right? You should like seated calf raise machines are just inherent. They've got thick pads. You can sit down. You can just like you. It's a great way for somebody to learn how to push through their calves. Once you get into a standing position, you throw balance into the equation. You throw a whole other mix of variables that makes it harder. Also, you can constrain a seated calf raise a lot easier than a standing calf raise, right? Like a standing calf raise, almost everybody, like you'll see it once or twice when they get fatigued, they'll drive their knee forward and bend that knee a little bit, and then they get a little pop out of the quad to then get more momentum so that they don't have to use their calf at that mid range or whatever it is, which again is inherently where we want the calf to get stronger. So like we're negating the most important area of calf training with a standing calf raise. So by no means is it like one is better than the other. You can do both and you can train both to failure pretty quickly and pretty easily. So I don't think that like creating this arbitrary standard of seated versus standing, I get upset about, because it really does not take that much time to like go. Like I posted on Instagram probably close to a year ago now, but one time I just like set a timer on my watch and I said, okay, I'm gonna do single leg on each and take both to failure for 3 sets. So I did 3 sets to failure on my right and left leg independently on a seated calf raise. 3 sets of failure on my right and left leg in a standing calf raise. And I just timed and see, like, didn't look at my watch the whole time. It took me like just shy of 9 minutes, maybe like 8.5 minutes to do both, right? Sufficient loading, all those sorts of things. The calves can recover very quickly, right? So the 8.5 minutes that it's going to take you to do both is not going to kill you. And it's like probably going to help out when it comes to just improving total abilities when it comes to, plantar flexion and force production. So you can tell it's a rant that I've gone on before. But yeah, I mean, like you can do standing and I'm sure you can get away with it and be fine. It's my bias that you probably need more than just, 3 sets a week of calf training if you really want to, improve the performance of the plantar flexors.
Okay. All right, this has been a lot. Last one I have for you. Hopefully you have. I've heard this, and no one's ever told me. I don't know where it's from, or if I saw, maybe a soccer coach told it to me. He said, "Old guys tear their Achilles, young guys strain their calf." You ever heard that?
I have not. That's an interesting. That's very interesting. You said old guys tear their Achilles, young guys strain their calf.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, like, yes, there is the classic, like, I don't know, 45-year-old man that, like, goes back into activity and blows his calf, probably because there's some metabolic changes and he hasn't been physically active for a longer period of time. So, like, that does happen. But we also know that age is a risk factor in elite sport for calf muscle strain injuries, right? If you're over the age of 35 and still playing elite sport, it is a risk factor for a calf muscle strain injury, even if you haven't had one in the past, right? So, like I can understand where somebody's coming from there. I don't necessarily fully agree. I think age inherently is a risk factor for lower limb injury. Like I would put both calf and Achilles injuries kind of in the same bucket of you. Like, surely there can be a 12-year-old that can strain his calf or her calf or their Achilles or whatever, right? That's not, what I'm not saying is it never happens, but what I'm saying is the likelihood is probably going to increase of both injuries, a calf muscle strain and an Achilles tendon rupture or just general injury as somebody ages. And this was something I mentioned his name a couple times. I've chatted with Brady Green a lot on these sorts of topics, and I have to give him credit for this. Where we had a conversation. I was like, well, yeah, age is a risk factor, and he was like, well, think about what happens during the aging process, right? Normally, we see decreased, like muscles get smaller. There's less hypertrophy. Normally, the muscle fiber lengths decrease as well. Normally, the physical activity and just overall metabolic health of an individual decreases as well. And so, like, there's all of these factors that's like, I would argue if you are a healthy individual that exercises a lot, like it's probably not that, it may not just be the fact that, like, time has gone by that you're, like, now tearing your calf or tearing your Achilles. It is the fact that you are no longer participating in exercise and then think that you can dunk again because you did it one time when you were 18. And then that's when something happens. So I think it's an interesting topic. I've never heard that before, but I would just say age as a
Yeah.
general rule of thumb is something that people should probably, quote unquote, look out for if you're inactive and those sorts of things.
Yeah. Okay. I think it rang with me because I was like, I think at my old college there was a guy that tore his Achilles, but he was a fifth year senior basketball player, and I was just
Hmm.
like, you never see Achilles ruptures in college basketball, but NBA we're seeing a bunch of, you see Achilles ruptures, and it's like an age thing. So, but yeah, the calf thing is probably, you're gonna strain a calf whenever. But it's like, I'm not. I guess you have kids can avulse tendons, but it's like it's kind of a different injury. It's usually like you see those Achilles ruptures when people are getting a bit older. Okay. Everyone who's listening, if you don't have the calf, what's it called? Calf profiling. What's that
Yeah,
book
I think
called?
we call it comprehensive calf force profiling or something. We probably made the name too long,
Yeah.
but
What an awful
something like that.
awful name. What an awful name, but such a good resource. Yeah, dude. Such a good resource. So anyone listening should go get that. But anyways, tell everyone where to find you.
Yeah, man, Jake, I really appreciate the opportunity. It was a super fun chat, but I am on. I think I'm relatively responsive on Instagram. My name or username is dylancarmody.dpt on Instagram. Feel free, if they want to email me to set up a time to chat, you can reach out to me at d.carmody@vauld.com. And then otherwise, I mean, snail mail or something. I don't know. Those are probably the two areas that I'm most responsive on. So, yeah, it was an awesome conversation, and it's cool to be a part of the podcast, man. It's a great structure that you guys have, and I've been a big fan for a while. So really appreciate it.